Any doctor who has specialized in proctology knows that when facing various buttocks every day, it is very easy to become desensitized. As someone who has been a proctologist for a decade, having to examine 20 buttocks daily, I have completely lost any emotional response to any buttocks. Moreover, I can calmly handle even the most bizarre situations that arise in my daily work. However, that day, when confronted with a child's buttock and hearing the words "the psychiatric department is to the left when you go out, then go upstairs, and it's the first room," it led me to become an unemployed vagrant for 5 years, a beggar for 2 years, and eventually I met a tragic end, dying in a car accident on the street, and now, I have strangely found myself back in the office. Director? Director. In a trance, I heard someone calling me urgently. I snapped back to reality from my thoughts and instinctively replied, "What's the matter?" At that moment, a steaming cup of water appeared on the desk, accompanied by a voice saying, "Director, it seems that you haven't been getting enough rest recently. I poured you a cup of hot water." I looked up and was surprised to see that it was Xiao Zhang, an intern from 8 years ago. "It's okay, there have been too many patients recently, and I'm exhausted. I'll be fine after taking a break," I said while looking around. Indeed, this was the office where I served as the director of the proctology department at the municipal hospital 8 years ago. In an instant, a bold and almost absurd idea flashed through my mind. I had been reborn, back to 8 years ago, when all the misfortunes had not yet begun. To confirm that this was not a fantasy, I pinched myself hard. A sharp pain shot through me, and I realized this was not a dream. Shall I call in the next patient? Xiao Zhang's question interrupted my train of thought. I nodded in agreement, and soon after, the office door slowly opened. A lady of extraordinary temperament walked in. She was extremely beautiful, dressed in high-end designer clothes, and exuded an air of nobility that made her seem unapproachable. Following closely behind her was a man with sharp eyes and a handsome face. Every gesture he made revealed the imposing aura of a person in a position of authority. The moment I saw them, I was stunned as if struck by lightning. It was them. Familiar fear and hatred welled up in my heart, and a stabbing pain came from my palm. I looked down and saw a deep fingernail mark in my palm. The lady's cheeks blushed slightly, and with a hint of shyness, she said softly, "Hello, Dr. Su Mingming." Compared to the man, Su Mingming was relatively polite. However, the man beside her wore a look of disdain on his face and bluntly said, "Who do you think you are? You have no right at all to examine my child's buttock." Hearing this familiar conversation and seeing this all too familiar scene, I no longer had any doubts in my heart. I had truly been reborn. Su Mingming gently tugged at the hem of the man beside her. Gu Zhao's clothes and looked up at him with a reproachful glance. There was not a hint of seriousness in her eyes, but rather a touch of special charm. I composed myself, pushed my glasses up, and looked calmly at the couple in front of me. Said neither humbly nor arrogantly, "Excuse me, I have been working as a proctologist at the municipal hospital for 10 years, and am now the director of the proctology department in the professional field. I believe I am more qualified than you." Gu Zhao's face darkened instantly, and his eyes revealed a trace of coldness, as if he was considering how to deal with me, someone who dared to defy him. Then, he let out a cold snort and said viciously, If you can't cure Meng Bao, I'll make your whole family pay with their lives." It was this extremely annoying sentence again. In my previous life, when I heard him say this, I was filled with helplessness. It was already, and there were actually still people imitating the cheesy lines from the domineering CEO novels of decades ago. At that time, I sincerely suggested that he go to the psychiatric department. As a result, my words seriously offended his so-called dignity as a domineering CEO. He used his power to deliberately create a medical accident, forcing me to resign from my job. Moreover, he exerted pressure everywhere, warning all the hospitals in the city not to hire me, leaving me completely unemployed. Unable to work in a hospital, I thought about finding a job in a factory to make a living, but Gu Xiao was like a ghost, blocking all my paths. Not a single enterprise dared to take the risk of hiring me. In order to survive, I could only rely on setting up stalls intermittently and even picking up recyclables to barely make ends meet. During those days, I drank stagnant water by the roadside and ate cold takeout that others had thrown away in the trash. The hardships of life were like a huge mountain, pressing me down and making it difficult to breathe. Pulling my thoughts back to the present, I lowered my eyes and nonchalantly flipped through the medical records. Then I said coldly, "Sorry, without an appointment, I can't see the patient." Family doctors and private hospitals, which are the standard for a domineering CEO like Gu Xiao, generally never set foot in public hospitals naturally. They don't know that seeing a doctor at the municipal hospital requires making an appointment in advance. Moreover, I'm a specialist, and one has to make an appointment a day in advance. I'm only on duty 1 day a week, so my appointment slots are always very hard to get. Just then, the office door was pushed open in a hurry, and a panting voice said, "Doctor, I was just called. I went to the toilet and was delayed. I'm really sorry." It turned out that the patient who had actually gotten a number for the appointment had arrived. I looked at Gu Xiao and Su Mingming and said unceremoniously, "Unrelated people, please leave the room first." Their faces immediately turned extremely ugly, alternating between red and green like a color palette. Su Mingming looked embarrassed, stood up, and dragged Gu Xiao out. Before leaving, Gu Xiao still stubbornly gave me a fierce glare with his sharp eyes like blades. I didn't show any weakness and casually glanced back just as I was about to call the security guards to drag these two Q-jumpers out. He reluctantly retracted his gaze. After finishing the examination of the patient, I picked up the pen and wrote out the diagnosis form, saying, "Take this form to the nurse." Ding dong. A clear bell rang out suddenly, and I instinctively looked around, trying to find the source of the sound. "Hello, host Yao. I am the disease pain transfer system. Congratulations on successfully passing the language provocation node by Gu Xiao and avoiding the subsequent tragic events." A mechanical yet somewhat playful voice gently sounded in my mind. A system? Could this be the cheat code that came with my rebirth? I wondered in my mind and asked, what does the disease pain transfer system mean? As the name implies, I can help people transfer the pain of diseases. My awakening in you means that every time you successfully treat a patient, the pain of the diseases that the patient has suffered in the past will be transferred to the male lead, Gu Xiao. The system explained in detail. I nodded inwardly. In that case, Gu Xiao was going to have a hard time. However, I quickly caught a key word in the system's words, male lead. I couldn't help but ask further, "System, you said that Gu Xiao is the male lead. Does that mean the world I live in is a novel?" "That's right. Host, you are living in the book titled Murga's Sweet and Innocent Wife. Su Mingming is the female lead, and Gu Xiao is the male lead." The system then briefly told me the general content of the book. After hearing it, I couldn't help but exclaim in my heart how absurd it was. Due to your death in your previous life, the personalities of Gu Xiao and Su Mingming were damaged. Our administration has given you the opportunity to be reborn and has also equipped you with me, this system. I suddenly understood in simple terms. This rebirth was a great opportunity given by fate for me to avenge myself. Remembering my previous life, Gu Xiao held a grudge against me and repeatedly sent people to cause trouble in the hospital, falsely accusing me of a series of medical accidents that I didn't commit. In order to prove my innocence, I collected evidence and argued my case. Without sleep after finally resolving the crisis, the leader began to doubt me. Since then, my name was removed from many external exchange projects, and I was excluded from important lectures in the hospital. Even the director position that I had painstakingly obtained was replaced by someone Gu Xiao had stuffed in. At that time, I just thought that as long as I could continue working, it would be a great blessing. After all, the power of the wealthy family was too great, and I simply couldn't afford to offend them. So, I swallowed my pride, sincerely made an appointment to meet Gu Xiao, and bowed my head to apologize to him. But he still maintained that arrogant and overbearing attitude and casually said, "So, who are you?" I naively thought that this matter was finally over and that I could live in peace from then on. However, unexpectedly, not long after, the person Gu Xiao had placed in the hospital falsely accused me of stealing hospital medications, claiming that I had a corrupt character. Just like that, I was fired again, and this time, all the hospitals in the city closed their doors to me. None of them were willing to hire me. During that period, I was in a daze all day long, like a walking corpse. My parents, seeing me in such a state, were extremely shocked. They hugged me tightly and comforted me, saying, "It's okay. Even if the sky falls, your parents will hold it up." But I never expected that the devil Gu Xiao would not spare even my parents. Su Mingming falsely accused my mother of stealing her jewelry without any evidence. Just because of her status and position, the police directly sentenced my mother. When my father went to visit my mother and came back, he was only holding a small box. I had never seen my father look so distraught, dejected, and hopeless. At that moment, I knew something had happened to my mother. My heart was filled with blame, and regret. If it weren't for me, how could my mother have suffered such a disaster? I was broken, and cried my heart out, almost out of breath. And my father just gently embraced me in his arms, patted my back slowly, and said nothing. However, misfortune did not stop there. Not long after, I received the news of my father's death. He was killed in a car accident on his way driving. The moment I heard this news, my eyes went dark, and I almost fainted. I hurriedly put down the pancake I was making at the stall, hailed a taxi, and rushed like crazy to the scene of the car accident. When I arrived, my beloved father, already covered in blood, was lying quietly in the familiar car. He could no longer hold me tightly and comfort me. That car was all too familiar to me. It was the one that Gu Xiao usually rode in. It was Gu Xiao again. The hatred in my heart erupted like a volcano. I could no longer hold it back and shouted angrily at the sky. "Is there no end to this? Isn't it enough to have ruined me like this? What more do you want? Go to hell. Go to hell. Go to hell." Host. The system's voice rang out cautiously in my mind, trying to wake me up from the painful memories. I slowly blinked my eyes and broke free from those unbearable memories. Gu Xiao, Su Mingming. So what if you are the male and female leads in this novel world? I fought my way back from the abyss of hell this time. Even if you have the halo of the leads, I will shatter it completely. You will pay a heavy price for the sins you committed in the previous life. I will make you pay for the blood debt of my family with your lives. In the land of a city, which is full of talents, I was able to work my way up to become the director of the department at the municipal hospital and also hold the position of honorary professor at a university. This is sufficient proof that my medical skills are by no means ordinary. Without exaggeration, in the field of proctology, I can confidently claim to be the best in the country. Usually, business trips for exchanges are quite common for me. After finishing today's shift, without the slightest hesitation, I immediately applied to the leader for a business trip for exchange. The leader readily agreed because there happened to be an exchange project that had been and no one had taken it over. For a doctor at my level, a business trip for exchange usually takes at least a month. Once I leave, Su Mingming's treatment will have to be postponed, and I will definitely perform surgeries during the exchange by then. Gu Xiao's buttocks will really suffer. As soon as I made the decision, after work, I went home, quickly packed my luggage, dragged the suitcase, and headed straight for the airport, boarding the departing flight. With the help of the system, everything has become much more convenient. It can report the situation there to me at any time. On the first day of arriving in C City, just after finishing an academic exchange activity, the system's voice rang out in my mind. Su Mingming went to the hospital to look for you and found that your name was not on the registration list. I couldn't help but chuckle. That guy Gu Xiao must be furious this time. It's the first time he has lowered himself to look for a doctor, but the doctor is on a business trip and not on duty. Just thinking about Gu Xiao's face, which would be as black as ink, made me laugh even more heartily. Xiao Zhang was left at the municipal hospital at this time. He also called me. Teacher, I'm not disturbing you, am I? Do you remember the couple who came yesterday? That man who always said those domineering CEO lines, and his girlfriend. Xiao Zhang's tone was full of excitement, as if he had encountered something particularly interesting. Yes, what's up? I asked curiously. They made a huge scene at the hospital today. The scene was simply amazing. Xiao Zhang vividly described it on the other end of the phone. I seemed to be there, and the scene appeared in front of my eyes. Gu Xiao and Su Mingming came to the hospital when they learned that I was on a business trip. They were immediately furious. Gu Xiao, this son of heaven, had never suffered such humiliation before. He arrogantly took out his phone in the hospital lobby and shouted loudly, "You have 3 minutes. If you can't find that woman, I'll make your whole family pay with their lives." The municipal hospital was always crowded with people. His shout immediately attracted the attention of everyone around. This person must be crazy. There's no hope for him. Someone in the crowd whispered. A kind-hearted hospital volunteer stepped forward and politely asked, "Handsome guy, the psychiatric department is on the 3rd floor. Do you need me to take you there? Get lost. Do you know who I am?" Gu Xiao glared angrily at the volunteer and shouted. Well, his action successfully attracted the attention of the psychiatrists. I smiled and hung up Xiao Zhang's phone, feeling extremely satisfied. There is still an operation to be done in the afternoon. I can't wait to hear the news that Gu Xiao's buttocks hurt. At 2:30, I dressed neatly and walked into the operating room, accompanied by a group of young doctors who came to observe and learn. Today's patient is an elderly man suffering from rectal cancer. Although this type of cancer does not directly endanger life immediately, it can bring great pain to the patient and severely affect the quality of life. The key to the operation lies in precisely removing the diseased part. Once this step is successfully completed, the operation is basically considered a success. 2 hours later, the operation was successfully concluded. I patiently instructed the patient's family members to pay attention to the patient's postoperative diet, keeping it light, and at the same time encourage the patient to engage in appropriate exercise, which is beneficial for physical recovery. When I returned to the office, the system informed me that it had successfully transferred the patient's disease pain. However, the system cannot completely transfer all the disease pain to Gu Xiao, so, for now, all Gu Xiao has is just hemorrhoids. A domineering CEO with hemorrhoids? Just imagining that scene makes me feel goosebumps all over my body. Ugh. After work, I went back to the dormitory to rest. Lying on the bed, I dialed my parents' phone number when I heard their familiar voices. Tears almost welled up in my eyes. I held back my tears and told them not to worry about me, and to take good care of themselves. I said I would be home soon. In this life, I will definitely do my best to protect my family. That night, I slept exceptionally soundly. The next day when I woke up, I threw myself back into the busy routine of lectures, consultations, and surgeries. In the afternoon, I went on my regular ward round to visit the elderly patient with rectal cancer from the previous day. Entering the ward, I saw the patient semi-reclining on the hospital bed, with a soft pillow behind his back. His children and grandchildren were gathered around the bedside. The patient had a ruddy complexion and seemed to be in good spirits. "Oh, Dr. Yu, thank you so much. If it weren't for you, I don't know how long but would have been hurting." As soon as the patient saw me, he immediately became excited and tried to sit up to shake my hand. I quickly stepped forward to hold him down and smiled, saying, "You're welcome. I'm a doctor, and this is all part of my job. How are you recovering? Is there anything unusual about the wound?" No, after the operation, I feel so much better. Before, I was so careful with what I ate, afraid of having a bowel movement or urinating every time I went to the toilet. It was like going through torture, but now, after the operation, I don't feel any discomfort at all. The patient expressed his feelings in simple words. Hearing this, I felt a great sense of relief and smiled, saying, "As long as you're recovering well, remember to keep a light diet." After leaving the ward, I made an excuse to get some fresh air and actually went to the hospital's small garden with no one around. I couldn't hold back anymore and burst into wild laughter. Just thinking that in the days to come, Gu Xiao would have to suffer from abdominal pain and bloody stools every day made me grin from ear to ear. This is just the beginning. In the future, I will make him pay an even heavier price for everything he did to me and my family in the previous life. In the last life, you caused my family to be destroyed. In this life, I will definitely make you suffer from rectal cancer and taste the endless pain. Time flew by, and my exchange at the hospital in City C had already passed half a month. The workload here is not too heavy, with an average of seeing one patient every 2 days, but as time goes by, the number of patients is still considerable. The system kept me informed of Gu Xiao's condition at all times. Host: Gu Xiao had bloody stools when he went to the toilet today. It seems he has several hemorrhoids. Host: Gu Xiao had severe abdominal pain today. He sat on the toilet for a full 2 hours, but couldn't relieve himself at all. Hearing these messages, I couldn't help but snicker. This had already become the source of my daily joy. As time passed, Gu Xiao's symptoms became more and more severe. Finally, 3 days before the end of my exchange, the hospital director called me. "Xiao Yu, put your exchange on hold for now. A patient has come to our hospital, and the situation is quite difficult. We really need you to handle it personally." The director's tone carried a hint of urgency and expectation. I pretended to speak earnestly and replied, "Director, thank you for your trust in me, but I really can't leave at the moment. Just received a patient, and I have to be responsible for seeing this case through to the end." The director was taken aback by my words and quickly said, "That's true, but you also need to prioritize. You're the director of our hospital, not someone else's hospital." He was putting pressure on me. I calmly said, "Director, I understand what you mean. How about you have a talk with this patient?" After saying that, I pretended to encounter an urgent matter and quickly hung up the phone. There was an operation in the afternoon, and by the time I finished it, 3 hours had passed. The director of the hospital in City C was very understanding. He smiled at me and said, "Xiao Yu, there's news from City A that they urgently need you back for an emergency and our exchange period is almost over. You can take a rest first and get ready to go back." I nodded and thanked him. "Okay, thank you, director." When I checked my phone, I was surprised. There were dozens of missed calls, all from the same number. I guessed right away that it was Gu Xiao. Sure enough, when I called back, Gu Xiao's almost roaring voice came through immediately. "Yu Yao, I order you to come back right now. Do you know how precious my time is? Making me wait for you. Can you afford the consequences?" I calmly said, "Mr. Gu, please don't shout so loudly. I can't hear you clearly. Since your time is so precious, then don't wait for me. After all, I really can't afford the consequences. I'll send a helicopter to pick you up right away." After saying that, he hung up the phone domineeringly, and that wild and unrestrained air of his seemed to come through the phone. I went to the designated location, and soon the helicopter arrived. I wondered in my heart, can a helicopter fly around so casually like this? With that question in mind, I boarded the helicopter. I have to admit that the helicopter was really fast. In just 1 hour, I was back in City A. As soon as I arrived at the hospital, the director personally came to greet me. Elderly man in his 60s led me on a jog all the way to the proctology department. "Mr. Gu, I'm really sorry to have kept you waiting," the director said as he bent over to apologize. Gu Xiao was lying face down on the hospital bed and let out a cold snort. "Woman, what are you standing there for? Hurry up and examine me." My voice was as cold as ice, like that of an experienced fisherman who had been killing fish for 10 years. Without the slightest warmth, Gu Xiao obviously didn't expect such a process and looked at me in shock, shouting loudly, "How dare you examine my buttocks?" I retorted without showing any weakness. "You asked me to examine you. Mr. Gu, in order not to waste your precious time for making money, please cooperate." Gu Xiao closed his eyes, the veins on his forehead bulging. He gritted his teeth and spat out a word, "Get out." I looked at him twice and was about to leave when I heard him say, "You stay, and everyone else get out." Only Gu Xiao and I were left in the ward. He slowly took off his trousers and raised his buttocks. My hands, slightly cool, gently parted his buttocks. He couldn't help but shudder and said viciously, "I'll kill you." I remained unmoved and said calmly, "Well, I'm going to insert my finger for the examination. Try to bear it." Then, I inserted my finger. He let out a muffled groan. If Su Mingming heard this sound, her legs would probably go weak, I thought to myself. After the examination, Gu Xiao had completely lost face in this life and didn't dare to meet my eyes at all. I wrote out the diagnosis form and said, "Take this to the nurse." He heaved a sigh of relief as if a great burden had been lifted. "You have several hemorrhoids and need to have surgery." Hearing this, the heart he had just put down was raised again. I paid no more attention to him, picked up my bag, left the hospital, and returned home. My parents had already been waiting at home and cooked a table full of my favorite dishes. The moment I saw my parents, I could no longer control my emotions. I dropped my backpack, rushed over, and hugged them tightly. Tears welled up in my eyes and gradually wet their clothes. My mother gently stroked my face with a pained expression and asked with concern, "What's wrong, Yao Yao? Did someone bully you?" I held back my tears and said, "It's nothing, I just miss you so much." I wiped away my tears and sat at the dining table with my parents. The familiar and long, missed taste filled my taste buds. How long had it been since I last savored it? Looking at my parents' smiles and seeing them constantly picking food for me, I secretly vowed in my heart, "Mom and Dad, in this life, I will definitely protect you well and make Gu Xiao pay a heavy price for what he did in the previous life." After dinner, our family sat around watching TV. While watching, I thought of the tragic experiences of my parents in the previous life. My heart tightened, and I summoned up the courage to say, "Mom and Dad, resign from your jobs." My parents were old and were already at an age when they could enjoy their twilight years at home. It was just that they couldn't stand being idle, so they found jobs. Besides, I was now the director of the hospital with an annual salary of several $100,000, which was more than enough to support my parents. I nervously held my parents' hands and looked at them firmly. My parents looked at each other. My mother held my hand in return and said gently, "Yao Yao, Mom and Dad promise you." My parents were always very stubborn before. When I told them that taking too many health products was bad for their health, they didn't listen at all. It was not until an authoritative program exposed the truth that they patted their chests and said, "It seems that Yao Yao is right." I was surprised that they agreed so readily this time, and couldn't help widening my eyes slightly. My mother looked at me, the corners of her mouth slightly curving upward. She took a deep breath and said, "Your father and I had a similar dream a few days ago." My mother's voice trembled slightly. "No, not similar, it was exactly the same dream." My mother told her and my father's dream with a trembling voice. As I listened, my tears could no longer be held back and fell one by one. My father reached out beside me and gently wiped away my tears with a pained expression. As my mother continued to tell the story, I gradually realized that my parents might have been reborn too, and my tears flowed even more profusely. My mother skipped over her painful experiences in prison and directly said, "After I died, it seemed that my soul was still there. I could still see you and your father, Wu." As she spoke, my mother covered her mouth and her body trembled with sobs. "Later, your father was also gone. Wu, I saw you, Wu." My mother couldn't say a complete sentence anymore, and just kept crying and shedding tears. My mother took a moment to calm down and continued, "My Yao Yao, so excellent, so proud, but you suffered so much it must have hurt a lot, right?" My mother stroked my head and asked me with eyes full of heartache, "Dreams are all fake. Our Yao Yao will definitely be healthy and live a long life." The family hugged each other and wept bitterly. If an outsider saw this scene, they would surely be puzzled. Fortunately, this was at home. After calming down my emotions, I took a deep breath and said, "Dad, Mom, I was reborn. Those tragic things really happened." As soon as these words were spoken, even my tough as nails father couldn't hold back tears, and snot flowed together. My mother hugged me tightly and said firmly, "It's Mom who is useless, but now, Mom and Dad are by your side, and will never let anyone hurt my daughter again. When our family is together, we are the most indestructible force." I could see that my parents had something to say, so I looked at them and encouraged them to speak. "Let's not resign for now," my mother said. "Your father and I have a plan. Since they were so heartless in the previous life, then I don't need to be a good person anymore." My mother's tone was firm, with a hint of barely perceptible fierceness. "In the previous life, that woman falsely accused me of theft. Fine. This life, I must teach her a lesson." I widened my eyes in surprise, thinking, "Mom, you're so brave." My father nodded in agreement beside her. I thought to myself, my parents were not playing by the rules. My mother patted my hand reassuringly and said, "Don't worry." I swallowed and nodded slightly. After sharing these heartfelt words, the bond within our family became even deeper. I went to work and came home as usual. Occasionally, my parents would urge me to get married. Since the last time I diagnosed Gu Xiao, he hadn't shown up at the hospital for half a month and hadn't come to look for me either. I had a peaceful time. It's just that sometimes people can't talk about things once you mention them. Trouble comes. Ring ring. The phone suddenly rang. I looked at the caller. It was exactly the number that had made dozens of calls before. "Gu Xiao, hello? Mr. Gu, what can I do for you?" I asked, feigning calmness. "I'll send someone to pick you up at the hospital right away." Gu Xiao's tone was still as overbearing as ever, leaving no room for negotiation. I loathed his domineering attitude to the core, yet for the sake of my subsequent plans, I still made my way to the hospital entrance. Soon, a black sedan pulled up. The person in the passenger seat rolled down the window and said, "Get in, Director Yu." I secretly thought to myself that this person's manner was rather like that of a powerful eunuch beside an emperor. I opened the car door and got in the car. Drove for 40 minutes and arrived at the most luxurious villa area in City A. After entering the garage, the person in the passenger seat got out first and respectfully opened the car door for me, saying, "This way, Dr. Yu." I increasingly felt that he resembled an eunuch entering the house. That person led me to the second floor. Gu Xiao was lying face down on the bed when he saw me coming. A glimmer of light flashed in his eyes. "Hurry up and take a look at me." As my condition worsened, I nodded and said, "I'll go out and prepare first. You also get ready, Mr. Gu." Gu Xiao, a CEO with an extremely strong sense of territoriality, has always forbidden outsiders from freely entering and leaving his home. The assistant who had just brought me up had already left now. There were only Gu Xiao and me in the villa, which provided great convenience for my subsequent actions. I took out several miniature cameras from my bag, gently opened the door of the study, and skillfully concealed the cameras on the bookshelf. Then, I placed several more cameras in hidden corners of the living room. After doing all this, I put on my gloves and returned to the bedroom at this time. Gu Xiao was lying on the bed with his back to me. Took the opportunity to place a camera in the bedroom as well. Through my daily contact with numerous patients and with the assistance of the system, Gu Xiao's condition had gradually developed from a few mild internal hemorrhoids at the beginning to colon cancer at present. Although there was no professional equipment for testing, based on my many years of medical experience and Gu Xiao's typical symptoms, I was certain that he had colon cancer. Looking at his sorry state now, a glimmer of excitement welled up in my heart. However, this was far from enough. How could I let him endure only this much pain? After the examination, I calmly informed him of the fact that he had colon cancer. This once arrogant and overbearing so was so frightened that his face turned deathly pale. He trembled on the bed and pleaded with me. "Doctor, can my illness still be cured?" I gave an ambiguous answer. "As long as you strictly follow the doctor's orders." My reply was the essence of vague speak, and patients are often easily soothed by such words. Hearing my answer, his face regained a bit of color. I told him to recuperate at home for a few days and come to the hospital for admission in a week. When I got home, I turned on the computer, and several images were displayed on the screen, which were the surveillance videos from the cameras I had placed in Gu Xiao's villa. In the image, a woman in sexy pajamas appeared. When she turned her head, I recognized her as Su Mingming. I couldn't help but sigh. Gu Xiao was almost about to be hospitalized, yet he still had the mood for carnal pleasures. The actions of these male and female leads in this old-fashioned and cheesy drama were truly puzzling. Almost like criminal behavior, it could hardly bear to watch. In the image, the actions of the two became more and more intense. Suddenly, Gu Xiao started bleeding. Looking at the large pool of blood on the bedsheet, which seemed to be mixed with excrement, Su Mingming's face turned as white as a sheet. Xiao, what's wrong with you? Are you okay? Don't scare me. I'm fine. Mingming helped me lie down properly. Su Mingming's movements were slow and reluctant. Gu Xiao's face darkened, and he roared. "What? Are you starting to dislike me now? You're happy that I've become like this, aren't you? You can go find someone else. You slut. There are so many men out there. You don't need me. Get out." Su Mingming looked at him in disbelief and cried out. "Xiao, how could you say such things to me?" "Woo. Fine. You told me to go." With that, she covered her mouth and ran out. Watching this scene, the corners of my mouth twitched. These two really should go to the psychiatric department and the neurosurgery department for a thorough examination. However, these materials were extremely valuable. Through the system, I obtained the contact information of the second male lead and the third male lead. In this kind of old-fashioned novel, the second male lead and the third male lead also came from prominent families, were handsome, and had some connections with the underworld to some extent. Only they had the strength to compete with Gu Xiao. Before Gu Xiao was hospitalized, I carefully packaged the video materials of this week and asked the system to anonymously send them to the second male lead and the third male lead. After that, I received the news that Gu Xiao had been hospitalized, and he specifically requested me to treat him. Colon cancer is not an incurable disease, but Gu Xiao had already reached the middle stage under the detection of the hospital's sophisticated equipment. He probably only had about 2 years left to live. Out of the humanitarian spirit of a medical professional, I did not directly tell Gu Xiao the cruel truth that he only had 2 years to live. Instead, I chose to inform Su Mingming. Upon hearing this news, Su Mingming's eyes filled with tears. Instantly, she covered her mouth with her hands and wept pitifully. Her delicate and pitiable appearance would arouse pity in anyone who saw her. Of course, I didn't forget to disclose this news to the second male lead and the third male lead. When they heard that their beloved woman was heart-broken in the hospital, they were extremely anxious and rushed over to accompany her as soon as possible. TSK. Based on my understanding of Su Mingming, without Gu Xiao to provide her with a luxurious lifestyle, with her character, she would surely quickly seek another reliance. I was eagerly looking forward to that day. I really wanted to see what kind of expression Gu Xiao would have when he witnessed that scene. How wonderful it would be. The second male lead and the third male lead quickly joined forces, while Gu Xiao, being mercilessly tormented by illness at this time, was completely powerless to resist. Under their offensive, Gu Xiao's company soon fell into a review crisis. Gu Xiao could only helplessly lie on the hospital bed, cursing while enduring the severe pain of his body, and struggling to deal with work when he was feeling a bit better. The once glorious and powerful CEO had now fallen into such a tragic situation, which was truly lamentable. As time went by, the number of times Su Mingming came to visit Gu Xiao in the hospital became fewer and fewer. In the past, she would appear on time every day, carefully take care of Gu Xiao, and bring the soup she had cooked herself, showing great tenderness and consideration. But now, it was a rare occasion if she came once a week. Such a huge contrast soon alerted Gu Xiao. That day, when I went on my ward round, as soon as Gu Xiao saw me, he grabbed me like a drowning man grasping at a straw and viciously ordered, "You, go and bring that woman Su Mingming to me immediately." I couldn't help rolling my eyes and said irritably, "Could you please be quiet? If you move around again, you'll start bleeding, and then no one will be willing to clean up the blood." The situation of Gu Xiao's company was getting worse and worse, continuously declining. Affected by this, his hospital room was reluctantly downgraded from the originally luxurious and comfortable single room to a simple double room with poor conditions. The cleaners in the double room didn't have that much patience to clean up the bloodstains and excrement he left behind. After the ward round, I returned to the office, and my mother's call came at the right time. "Hello, Mom." Judging from my mother's excited tone, she must have encountered something really great. "Come home for dinner tonight, your father, and I have an excellent piece of news to tell you." I happily agreed. After work, I packed my things and couldn't wait to rush home. As soon as I entered the house, I saw that my mother had cooked a large table full of delicious dishes, and my father was pouring drinks beside her. My mother asked with concern, "Has that Su Mingming not gone to the hospital to visit Gu Xiao recently?" I replied truthfully, "No. Gu Xiao has cancer. I guess she doesn't even want to see him." However, my mother said something with hidden meaning. "That's not what I mean anyway. You need to be more careful recently." Although I was a bit puzzled, I still nodded obediently and replied, "Okay." Another day at work, Su Mingming, whom I hadn't seen for a long time, actually showed up at the hospital. But she looked very strange. She wore a hat, a pair of sunglasses, and was wrapped up tightly, as if she was afraid of being recognized. She looked as if she had done something shameful. I asked a colleague to inquire about it and learned that she had registered with many departments, as if there was something seriously wrong with her body. The dermatology department diagnosed that her skin was irritated, with symptoms of peeling and ulceration. The internal medicine department found that her organs were failing, and her physical condition was worrying. As soon as I heard this, I guessed roughly that this was probably my mother's masterpiece. Could it be that my mother poisoned her? But wouldn't this be too risky and easy to be exposed? I quickly retrieved her medical records and examined them carefully. I found that there were no signs of poisoning at all, and these symptoms appeared inexplicably. Even the psychiatric department determined that due to excessive stress, her body's hormone balance was disrupted and difficult to adjust. Looking at this flawless medical record, I instantly understood my mother's cleverness. I immediately called my mother. "Mom, Su Mingming came to the hospital today, and she doesn't look well." My mother replied calmly, "I know she has been like this at home for a while." Some things were not convenient to say clearly on the phone, but I had already understood my mother's hint. "It's brilliant, really brilliant," I secretly admired in my heart. Subsequently, I deliberately went to Gu Xiao's ward and pretended to casually mention the encounter with Su Mingming. As soon as Gu Xiao heard this, he became extremely excited. He jumped off the hospital bed directly, ignoring the pain in his body, and ran out of the ward like crazy, shouting, "Mingming! Mingming! Did you come to find me?" I followed him unhurriedly. I have to say that Gu Xiao, as the male lead, didn't take much effort to find Su Mingming, who was fully armed. He excitedly hugged Su Mingming and, regardless of the fact that this was a public place in the hospital, was about to take off Su Mingming's mask and lean in to kiss her. However, he suddenly stopped. His face turned livid instantly, and he roared, "What's that on you? Tell me the truth. While you were away from me, did you go to find another man? Who is he? You shameless woman." Gu Xiao's voice was extremely loud, and his face turned red due to excessive excitement. The wound on his buttocks burst open, and blood instantly spurted onto his pants. It was obvious that he was very angry. Su Mingming's eyes were filled with tears, and she shook her head desperately, crying, "You actually don't trust me, woo." At this moment, the silk scarf around Su Mingming's neck was torn off by Gu Xiao. I clearly saw the prominent hickey on her neck. This was really eye-catching. I could see it clearly even from such a distance. When Gu Xiao saw this, he cursed even more loudly. Su Mingming just kept crying. Just then, I stepped forward and said seriously, "Noise is prohibited in the hospital." As soon as I finished speaking, the second male lead appeared at the right time. He took a quick step forward and put his arm around Su Mingming, asking anxiously, "Mingming, what's wrong with you? Are you okay?" Seeing this scene, even if Gu Xiao was slow-witted, he understood what was going on. He shouted that Su Mingming was a slut and accused her of infidelity. I took the opportunity to drag Gu Xiao back to the ward humph. "Don't worry, there are more blows waiting for you." The second male lead appeared at this time, of course, because I asked the system to notify him in advance. He came just at the right moment. When I got home from work, my mother pulled me and looked at me from left to right. After making sure there was no one around, she whispered, Your mother is just an ordinary nanny who can only cook and doesn't know anything. I understood in my heart that my mother was explaining to me what she had done to Su Mingming. It turned out that my mother cleverly used the principle of food incompatibility to cook for Su Mingming. At first, Su Mingming didn't have any abnormal reactions in her body, but as time went by, various problems came one after another, such as hair loss, freckles, obesity, organ failure, and so on. Moreover, my mother was extremely cautious in her actions. She would never buy incompatible foods on the same day, and every time she went shopping, she specifically went to the market without surveillance. In this way, even if the police came, they couldn't find any clues. I listened intently and thought, without that delicate and charming face, would the second male lead and the third male lead still be as obsessed with Su Mingming as before? My father used to be Gu Zhao's driver. Since Gu Zhao's company had problems, he resolutely resigned and left. Learning this news, I was in an extremely good mood and went to work happily the next day. At this time, Gu Zhao had already lost his former arrogance. He was like an eggplant beaten by frost, lying listlessly on the hospital bed. Looking at his appearance, I smiled with satisfaction. However, this was far from the end. One day, the system suddenly told me that Gu Zhao's company was found to have evaded taxes, and he was about to be taken away for investigation. I asked curiously, "How was this discovered?" The system replied, "Su Mingming helped the second male lead steal the key documents from Gu Zhao's study. The surveillance cameras you installed before should have recorded this scene." Sure enough, the police came very quickly. A few hours later, they came to the hospital and took Gu Zhao away. Humph. Now you can go to prison and enjoy the last days of your life. I also anonymously sent the video of Su Mingming stealing the materials to the police. As expected, Su Mingming was taken away as well. Just when I was fully convinced that my revenge plan had been a great success, Gu Zhao came back. Alas, as expected of the male lead, his vitality is tenacious. It's not that easy to defeat him. It is said that Gu Zhao's grandfather stepped in with his connections and influence. He managed to shift the charge of tax evasion onto someone else, and even arranged a scapegoat. In this way, Gu Zhao was acquitted and released. Moreover, he even requested to settle the matter with Su Mingming privately with the police. This meant that he took Su Mingming out of the police station as well. I couldn't help but sigh. The male lead's aura is truly powerful, and I have to admire it. Gu Zhao was still my patient not long after. I met his grandfather. His grandfather looked extremely anxious and demanded that I perform the operation on Gu Zhao as soon as possible. Without a second thought, I readily agreed. This was an excellent opportunity that presented itself. Soon, the day of Gu Zhao's operation arrived. At this time, Gu Zhao's condition had already progressed to the late stage of colon cancer. In such a situation, the number of successful cases of surgical cure was extremely rare, almost equivalent to a death sentence. The probability of the operation being successful was less than 1%. In my opinion, he was no different from a dead person. Now that things had come to this, I felt there was no need to hide it anymore. So I told Gu Zhao about his real condition. Surprisingly, he showed a calm demeanor. However, Gu Zhao's grandfather was extremely anxious and kept ordering me to cure his grandson at all costs. I made full preparations, and Gu Zhao was wheeled into the operating room after an operation that lasted more than 2 hours. I was completely exhausted. However, something incredible happened. There was actually a possibility of Gu Zhao's cancer recovering. This simply went against medical common sense. Generally speaking, colon cancer in the middle and late stages is incurable, and even if an operation is performed, successful cases are extremely rare. But Gu Zhao, relying on his powerful male lead aura, managed to pull through. After the operation, I routinely informed Gu Zhao and his family about the precautions. But Gu Zhao is a proud son of heaven. He has always been arrogant and haughty. How could he obediently listen to me, a proctologist? With the help of his grandfather, Gu Zhao moved back to the single room. There were professional nurses taking good care of him, and there were bodyguards on duty at the door hours a day. Now, he no longer had to worry about the affairs of the company and led a life where everything was served to him on a silver platter. Su Mingming somehow learned the news that Gu Zhao's operation had been successful and came to the hospital to visit him again. As soon as she arrived, she wanted to send the nurse away, clamoring that she would cook and take care of Gu Zhao herself. Su Mingming knew nothing about postoperative recovery. I was going to send her away, but when I walked into the ward, I was completely stunned. The Su Mingming in front of me had long lost her former beauty. Her hair had become sparse, and her scalp was faintly visible. Her face was covered with spots and pimples, leaving many red and black acne marks. New pimples were still popping up, red and white. Her figure had also changed. It was no longer the curvy and graceful woman she used to be. She was as thin as a dry bamboo pole. I secretly marveled in my heart. Mom, your methods are really ruthless. I patted my chest and was glad that my mother had already resigned not long ago. Otherwise, it would really be easy to get into trouble. I kindly advised Su Mingming not to interfere with the nurse's work. Otherwise, it would be difficult to deal with the consequences if something went wrong. But Gu Zhao regained his arrogant attitude and roared at me. What do you know? Get out. My Mingming baby can take care of me just fine. I secretly laughed to myself. Gu Zhao was in such a situation. And yet he could still have feelings for Su Mingming, who looked like this. He really had no standards when it came to love. Su Mingming was quite diligent and hardworking. She took care of Gu Xiao in the hospital for more than half a month and prepared various nourishing soups every day. And Gu Xiao, except when going to the toilet, hardly got out of bed. This was exactly what I wanted. Sure enough, one morning, Gu Xiao never opened his eyes again. He died, succumbing to postoperative complications. Gu Xiao, relying on his male lead aura, survived the most difficult operation. However, under Su Mingming's care, which ignored the doctor's orders, he never exercised and rarely even moved his upper body. As time went by, his blood circulation was poor, and a blood clot formed. Eventually, he died in the hospital bed. When Gu Xiao's grandfather learned the news of his grandson's death, he was heartbroken and cursed Su Mingming, demanding compensation from her. Su Mingming had no money and was so scared that she slipped away quietly. No one knew where she had gone. Gu Xiao's grandfather, an old man with white hair, sending off his young grandson, was extremely sad, and the second male lead and the third male lead took the opportunity to suppress the Gu group. The illegal and criminal acts that Gu Xiao had committed before, such as kidnapping and imprisonment, in order to get Su Mingming, were also exposed one by one. It's a pity that he was already dead and could only bear the infamy in the underworld. It is said that Su Mingming later shuttled between the second male lead and the third male lead. Without her beautiful face and figure, she was like a ball being kicked back and forth between the two of them. Moreover, she even pestered my mother, saying such absurd things as since my mother had cooked for her, she should cook for her for the rest of her life, and that this was my mother's blessing. This is simply ridiculous. Where's the logic in this? My mother immediately pulled me away. Seeing this, Su Mingming actually started crying and making a scene on the street, saying that my mother didn't know how to be grateful and was an ungrateful person. Fortunately, among the onlookers, half of them were my mother's good friends. They all stood up and scolded Su Mingming one after another, saying that she was young, but trying to extort my middle-aged mother. She should have some shame. Since then, I haven't heard any news about Su Mingming. As for Gu Xiao, he was zergaked by netizens and became a meme on the internet. He was called the only overbearing CEO in the world. If you love her, you should imprison her. He still remains at the top of the criticism list. And I still work conscientiously as a proctologist, busy seeing patients every day and occasionally attending exchange seminars. My parents are in even better health now. They are enjoying their old age at home and sometimes go to dance square dance. Ding. Congratulations, host, your revenge is successful. Welcome to a wonderful life. Wait a minute, am I still in a book? No, this is your real world. Goodbye, host.